Vivian Holbrook had always been particular about smells. Her mother used to say it was unseemly for a young woman to wrinkle her nose at perfectly ordinary things. The butcher's shop, the church basement after ladies' aid meetings, the neighbor's garbage on collection day. But Vivian couldn't help herself. She had what her grandmother called the nose, an unfortunate sensitivity that made her keenly aware of things others missed entirely. Which was why, when David returned 3 days before their wedding, she knew immediately that something was wrong. He stood on her doorstep at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning, and for a moment, she simply stared at him, trying to understand what her eyes were telling her. He was wearing the same blue shirt and gray trousers he'd had on when he left for his bachelor party in Burlington 5 days earlier. The shirt was wrinkled, but somehow clean, as if it had been carefully pressed after being crumpled. The trousers still held their sharp creases. His dark hair was combed neatly to the side, just as he always wore it, not a strand out of place despite his mysterious absence. His smile was the same lopsided grin that had charmed her at the church social 2 years ago. The same smile that had made her mother comment, with grudging approval, that at least this one had good teeth and decent posture. Everything about his appearance was exactly as it should be, exactly as she remembered. And yet, the wrongness hit her the moment she opened the door, before she'd even had time to register his presence consciously. It was the smell that reached her first, not garden earth, rich with compost and worms and the promise of growing things, but something else entirely. The deep, cold earth that hasn't seen sunlight in decades. The kind of earth that clung to gravediggers' boots and funeral directors' fingernails. The kind that filled old graves and forgotten root cellars. "David," she said, her hand still on the door handle. The brass was warm beneath her palm, a small anchor of reality in a moment that felt increasingly unreal. "Where have you been?" He took a step closer, and she had to fight the urge to step back. There was something about the way he moved. Too smooth, too deliberate. Like a man consciously thinking about each motion before making it. "Miss me?" He stepped forward again, and another wave of that terrible smell washed over her. Damp soil and something else. Something metallic and old that reminded her of pennies left too long in a pocket. "I'm sorry I worried you, Viv. Time got away from me." The way he said her name was wrong, too. He'd always called her Vivian in that slightly formal way of his, the way a man called a woman when he was courting her properly. Viv was what her school friends had called her, what her mother used when she was being affectionate. David had never used it, not once in 2 years of careful courtship. She wanted to ask him about the phone calls that had gone straight to silence when she'd tried his boarding house in Burlington. She wanted to ask about the frantic conversations she'd had with his friends, Tommy Brennan and Joe Sullivan, who swore they hadn't seen him since Friday night when they'd all gone out for dinner and drinks. She wanted to ask why his skin looked pale as bone china in the morning light, why his eyes seemed darker than she remembered, like looking into deep water. Instead, she found herself stepping aside to let him in, the gesture as automatic as breathing. "Mother's been beside herself," she said, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. "The wedding is Saturday. 3 days, David. Where could you possibly have been for 5 days without calling?" He moved through her small living room with careful, measured steps, but something was fundamentally different about the way he navigated the familiar space. David had always been light on his feet. It was one of the things she'd loved about dancing with him at church socials and town gatherings. But this was something else entirely. He seemed to glide rather than walk, his feet making no sound whatsoever on the hardwood floors her father had installed with such pride before his death 3 years ago. She found herself watching his feet as he crossed to the blue armchair by the window, the chair where her father used to read his evening paper and debate politics with himself in increasingly animated whispers. David's shoes, the same brown leather Oxfords he'd been wearing Friday night, touched the floor without so much as a whisper of sound. No creak of floorboards, no scuff of sole against wood. Nothing. "I went for a drive," he said, settling into the chair with the same uncanny silence. The cushions didn't even compress beneath his weight the way they should have. Needed to think. Vivian perched on the edge of the sofa, smoothing her skirt over her knees at the automatic gesture her mother had spent years trying to teach her. The movement felt important somehow, a small reminder of who she was, what was real and normal and expected. A drive? For 5 days? Cold feet, I suppose. He smiled again, and she found herself studying his teeth with the intensity of a dentist. They seemed whiter than usual, too white, like fresh paint or new snow. The kind of white that hurt to look at directly. "But I'm here now, ready to make you my wife." The word wife came out strangely, each syllable carefully enunciated, as if he'd never said it before, as if he were tasting it, rolling it around his mouth like a piece of candy he wasn't sure he liked. Vivian found herself studying the room as if seeing it for the first time. The morning sunlight streamed through the lace curtains her mother had hung 15 years ago, casting familiar patterns on the rug. Everything was exactly as it should be. Her grandmother's china shepherdess on the mantel, the stack of library books she'd been meaning to return, the small watercolor of the town square that her father had painted the year before he died. The only thing that seemed out of place was David himself sitting in her father's chair, as if he belonged there, but somehow making the entire room feel foreign and strange. "Mrs. Hartley said she saw you walking past the cemetery last night," she said, the words coming out more abruptly than she'd intended. "Around midnight." David's gaze fixed on hers with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. For a moment, she had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing something behind her, something she couldn't turn around to look at, something that might be standing just over her shoulder, watching them both with interest. Did she now? His voice was perfectly pleasant, conversational, but there was something underneath it that made her think of winter mornings when the temperature dropped so suddenly that the pipes froze. "Oh, Mrs. Hartley sees a lot of things, doesn't she? Especially at night. Especially when she's been sampling her late husband's brandy collection." There was a cruelty in the observation that was entirely unlike David. The David she knew would never have spoken dismissively about an elderly neighbor, would never have implied that Mrs. Hartley was a drunkard. David Crane was unfailingly polite, sometimes to the point of being tiresome. He held doors for strangers and helped old ladies with their groceries and always remembered to ask after people's ailing relatives. "She said you were carrying flowers," Vivian continued, watching his face carefully. "White roses. Must have been someone else." The response came too quickly, too smoothly, as if he'd been expecting the question. "Though I can understand the confusion. You know how these old ladies are. Eager for a bit of gossip to liven up their evenings." But Vivian knew it had been him. She knew David Crane's walk as well as anyone in Millbrook, had watched him traverse these same streets for 2 years of careful courtship. The way he favored his left leg slightly, a remnant of a childhood injury. The habit he had of pausing at intersections to look both ways twice, even on the quietest streets. The particular rhythm of his gait that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Mrs. Hartley might be 73 and half blind without her spectacles, but she'd lived on Elm Street for 40 years and knew every soul in town by their silhouette. If she said she'd seen David Crane walking past the cemetery at midnight, carrying white roses, then that's exactly what she'd seen. The question was why David was lying about it. "David," she said carefully, as if approaching a nervous animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale, tired." He leaned back in the chair, and she could swear the springs didn't creak the way they always did when anyone else sat there. Her father had been a substantial man, and even her mother's slight frame had been enough to make the old chair protest. But David sat as if he weighed nothing at all. "Never better," he said, and his smile was perfectly pleasant and perfectly wrong. "In fact, I've been thinking about our wedding, about the ceremony, about how we wanted to start our life together." Something cold settled in Vivian's stomach. "What about it?" "I'd like to make a change." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the smell of earth grew stronger. Not just stronger, but different, more complex. She caught hints of other things beneath the soil, metal and moisture, and something organic that had been left too long in the dark. Something to make the day more special, more memorable. What kind of change? The words felt thick in her throat. Vivian's stomach tightened. She'd spend months planning every detail of their wedding. The flowers, the music, the reception menu. Her dress hung in the closet upstairs, wrapped in tissue paper and lavender sachets. The church was reserved, the photographer hired, the cake ordered from the bakery in the next town over. What kind of change? The time. I'd like to be married at midnight. Midnight? She laughed, though it came out sounding more like a cough. "David, that's ridiculous. Reverend Morrison would never agree to marry us at midnight, and our guests..." "Not at the church," he said quietly. "At the cemetery." The room seemed to grow smaller around them. Vivian was aware of the ticking of the mantel clock, of the distant sound of Mrs. Patterson's dog barking 2 houses down, of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. "I beg your pardon?" "The cemetery would be perfect, romantic even, just you and me, under the stars." "David, you're not making sense. People don't get married in cemeteries." "Why not?" His voice was perfectly reasonable, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of gasoline. "It's quiet, private, no one to stare at us, no one to gossip about your dress or my mother's drinking. Because it's morbid and strange and unholy." "Is it?" He tilted his head to one side, studying her with those 2 dark eyes. "I thought you believed in eternal love, Vivian. What's more eternal than a cemetery?" She stood up abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. The smell was overwhelming now, filling the room like fog. "I think you should go home and rest. You're obviously exhausted from your trip wherever you went. We can talk about this later." "There's nothing to talk about. We're getting married Saturday at midnight in Millbrook Cemetery. I've already made the arrangements." "What arrangements? With whom?" But David was already standing, moving toward the door with that strange, soundless glide. "I'll pick you up at 11:45. Wear your dress, Vivian. The white one. It's important that you wear white." "David, wait." But he was gone, the door closing behind him with barely a whisper. Vivian stood alone in her living room, surrounded by the lingering smell of grave earth and something else. Something that reminded her of the time she'd found a dead bird in her garden 3 days after it had died. She sank back onto the sofa and buried her face in her hands. This was not how she'd imagined the week before her wedding would go. That evening, Vivian sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands and tried to make sense of what had happened. A conversation with David, if it had really been David, played over and over in her mind like a photograph needle stuck in a groove, repeating the same troubling melody. She'd spent months planning every detail of their wedding with the methodical precision her mother had taught her was essential for any important undertaking. The flowers had been ordered from Henderson's nursery. White roses and baby's breath, nothing too elaborate or expensive. The music had been selected after careful consultation with Mrs. Morrison, who played the church organ with more enthusiasm than skill, but was the only option in a town the size of Millbrook. The reception menu had been planned down to the last cucumber sandwich, with consideration given to both budget and the dietary restrictions of various elderly relatives. Her dress hung in the closet upstairs, wrapped in tissue paper and lavender sachets to keep away the moths. She'd sewn it herself over the course of 3 months, working by lamplight in the evenings after her job at the library, following a pattern from a magazine her mother had bought, especially for the occasion. It was simple but elegant. White satin with a modest neckline and long sleeves, exactly the sort of dress a respectable young woman should wear to her wedding. Everything had been perfect. Everything had been exactly as it should be. And now David wanted to throw it all away for some midnight ceremony in a cemetery, as if their months of careful planning meant nothing at all. She thought about the way he'd looked when he'd made his request, his face perfectly serious, as if he were discussing something as ordinary as the weather or the price of gasoline. The way his voice had remained calm and reasonable, even as he suggested something so fundamentally unreasonable that it bordered on madness. The time. I'd like to be married at midnight. The memory of those words made her shiver despite the warmth of the June evening. She wrapped her hands around the teacup, seeking comfort in its familiar weight and shape. But the porcelain felt cold as winter glass. Midnight? She could still hear the sound of her own laugh, brittle and sharp in the quiet living room. David, that's ridiculous. Reverend Morrison would never agree to marry us at midnight, and our guests. What would people think? Not at the church, he had said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. At the cemetery. Instead, she found herself walking to the kitchen window and looking out at the street. The evening was clear and warm, the kind of June night that made her think of summer romances and honeysuckle. A few houses down, the Hendersons were sitting on their front porch, their voices carrying on the still air. Everything looked normal, peaceful, exactly as it should. So why did she feel like she was watching it all from underwater? The phone rang, sharp and sudden in the quiet kitchen. Vivian jumped, sloshing cold tea onto her hand. Hello? Vivian? It's Janet Morrison. Janet was the Reverend's wife, a thin, nervous woman who taught Sunday school and organized the church's charity drives. She and Vivian had worked together on the wedding preparations, spending hours coordinating flowers and music and seating arrangements. Oh, hello, Janet. Is everything all right? That's what I was calling to ask you. Bob, Reverend Morrison, just had the strangest conversation with David. He came by the church about an hour ago asking about some very unusual things. Vivian's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of thing? He wanted to know about midnight services. Whether Bob had ever performed a wedding ceremony at midnight. And he asked some questions about the cemetery that I'm not sure I understood. What about the cemetery? He wanted to know if there were any restrictions on who could be buried there. Bob told him that anyone who dies in the parish can be interred in the church cemetery, assuming their family can pay the fees. But David kept asking about other types of burials. Whether there were any graves that weren't properly consecrated. The kitchen suddenly felt very cold. I don't understand. Neither do we. Bob finally had to ask him to leave. He seemed agitated, not like himself at all. Vivian, Is David feeling all right? Is there something wrong? Vivian closed her eyes. I don't know. He's been different since he came back. Came back? From where? He disappeared for 5 days. His bachelor party, supposedly. But his friends say they haven't seen him. He just showed up this morning, talking about changing our wedding plans. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Janet spoke again, her voice was careful, measured. Vivian, I think you should know. Bob checked the parish records after David left. We've had some unusual deaths in the area over the past few years. People who died suddenly, unexpectedly. And there have been some stories. What kind of stories? Old stories. The kind of thing people whisper about but don't really believe. About someone who comes for brides on their wedding day. Someone who takes the place of the groom. Vivian's hand was shaking now. That's superstition, Janet. Old wives' tales. Maybe. But Bob found something else in the records. 3 years ago, there was a young woman named Catherine Wells. She was supposed to be married on a Saturday morning. But the night before, she insisted on changing the ceremony to midnight. She wanted to be married in the cemetery. What happened to her? She went through with it. The wedding, I mean. But the next morning, they found her in her bed, dead. The coroner said it was heart failure, but she was only 22, perfectly healthy. And her husband? No one ever saw him again, just disappeared. Left everything. His job, his belongings, even his bank account. As if he'd never existed at all. Vivian set down her teacup with trembling fingers. Janet, I need to ask you something. The man you saw tonight, the one who spoke to your husband, are you certain it was David? Another pause. He looked like David. He sounded like David, but what? He was so cold, Vivian. I shook his hand when he arrived, and it was like touching marble. And his eyes, they were different somehow, darker, like looking into a well. After she hung up the phone, Vivian sat alone in her kitchen as the shadows grew longer outside her windows. She thought about David's pale skin, his 2 white teeth, the way he'd moved through her house without making a sound. She thought about the smell of earth that seemed to follow him like a shadow. And she thought about her wedding dress, hanging in the closet upstairs, waiting for Saturday morning. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Vivian lay in her narrow bed, listening to the house settle around her and trying to convince herself that everything would make sense in the morning. David had been under stress. All grooms were nervous before their weddings. The strange behavior, the odd requests, even the terrible smell could all be explained by anxiety and too much time alone on the road. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face as he'd asked her to marry him in the cemetery. The way his expression hadn't changed, as if he were discussing something perfectly ordinary. The way he'd said the word wife like he was learning a new language. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to the sound of footsteps in her garden. The bedside clock read 2:17 a.m. Vivian lay still listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling the house. They paused beneath her bedroom window, and she heard something that made her blood turn to ice water. A low, melodic humming. The tune was familiar. The wedding march. She crept to the window and peered through the lace curtains. The garden was bathed in moonlight, her mother's roses casting long shadows across the grass. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then a figure stepped out from behind the old oak tree, and her heart stopped. It was David, but not David. The man in her garden was taller, thinner, his limbs too long for his body. His skin was white as bone, and when he looked up at her window, his eyes were hollow pits in his skull. He was still humming the wedding march, but the melody was wrong, discordant, like a music box that had been broken and badly repaired. Their eyes met through the glass, and he smiled. His teeth were no longer white, but yellow, ancient, too many for his mouth. He raised one hand, a hand with too many joints, fingers that bent in directions fingers shouldn't bend, and beckoned to her. Vivian stumbled backward from the window, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a scream. When she found the courage to look again, he was gone. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning brought Mrs. Dorothy Pembridge to Vivian's door. Mrs. Pembridge was 84 years old, sharp as a tack, and the unofficial keeper of Millbrook's collective memory. She also happened to be David's great aunt, though she rarely spoke of the connection with anything approaching warmth. "You look terrible," she announced, settling herself in the blue armchair without invitation. "Like you've seen a ghost." "I didn't sleep well," Vivian said, pouring tea from her mother's good china service. Her hands were steadier than they'd been the night before, but only just. "I imagine not, considering." Mrs. Pembridge accepted her cup with a nod. "I heard about your visitor yesterday, and I heard about his unusual wedding plans. News travels fast in a small town. It does when it's the kind of news that makes people nervous. Vivian, dear, I need to tell you something about my nephew, something his mother never saw fit to share with you." Vivian set down her own cup. "What about David?" "David died last Friday night." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Vivian stared at the old woman, waiting for her to take them back, to explain that she'd misspoken or made some terrible mistake. "I beg your pardon?" "There was an accident on Route 7, just outside Burlington. David's car went off the road and hit a tree. He was killed instantly." Mrs. Pembridge's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "The state police called his mother Saturday morning. The funeral was Tuesday." "That's impossible. David was here yesterday. He spoke to me. The thing that spoke to you was not my nephew." Vivian felt the room beginning to spin. "Mrs. Pembridge, I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." "I'm trying to tell you that you're in danger. We all are." The old woman leaned forward, her pale eyes fixed on Vivian's face. "Have you ever heard of the Bone Bridegroom?" "No." "It's an old story. Older than this town, older than the church. It comes from the Japanese originally. A spirit called Gashadakuro, made from the bones of the dead. But the version we know here is different, changed by distance and time and the particular sorrows of New England." Mrs. Pembridge sipped her tea with steady hands. "The Bone Bridegroom appears when someone dies before their wedding day. He takes the form of the dead groom, wears his face, speaks with his voice. But he's not trying to return to life. He's trying to drag his bride down into death with him. That's impossible. That's superstition." "Is it? Think about the man who came to see you yesterday. Did he feel warm when you touched him? Did he cast a shadow? Did he smell like anything you'd ever smelled on a living person?" Vivian's throat felt dry as dust. "Even if what you're saying is true, which it isn't, why would David want to hurt me? He loved me. It's not David. That's what you're not understanding. David is dead, buried in Pine Grove Cemetery in Burlington. What's walking around in his shape is something else entirely. Something hungry. Hungry for what? For what it's always been hungry for. Life, warmth. A soul to keep it company in the dark." Mrs. Pembridge set down her teacup and reached into her pocketbook, withdrawing a small leather journal tied with a faded ribbon. "This belonged to my grandmother. She wrote down everything she could remember about the old stories, the old ways, including how to deal with the Bone Bridegroom." She handed the journal to Vivian, who took it with reluctant fingers. The leather was soft with age, worn smooth by decades of handling. What am I supposed to do with this? Read it. Learn from it. And for God's sake, don't go to that cemetery Saturday night. But if you don't, the thing wearing David's face will find another way to claim you. That's what it does. It's patient. It can wait. Mrs. Pembridge stood straightening her hat. But at least you'll have bought yourself some time to figure out how to stop it. After the old woman left, Vivian sat alone with the journal in her lap, afraid to open it. The afternoon sun streamed through her windows, illuminating dust motes in the air and making everything look normal, peaceful, safe. It was difficult to believe that anything supernatural could exist in such mundane surroundings. But then she thought about the figure in her garden, the hollow eyes and too many teeth. And she opened the journal to the first page. Margaret Pembridge, her book, Anno Domini, 1892. Being a true and faithful accounting of the strange happenings in the town of Millbrook, and the methods by which the good people of this place have protected themselves from the spirits that would do them harm. The handwriting was faded but legible, formed in the careful script of a woman who had been educated in an age when penmanship was considered a moral virtue. Vivian turned the pages slowly, reading about vengeful ghosts and unexplained disappearances, about protective charms and ancient rituals. And there, toward the middle of the journal, she found what she was looking for. The bone bridegroom comes for those who die with love unfinished. It takes the shape of the beloved, speaks with his voice, remembers his memories. But it is not him, and must never be mistaken for him, no matter how perfect the imitation. The creature feeds on the life force of the living, drawing strength from their warmth and breath and beating hearts. It is particularly drawn to brides, for the emotions surrounding a wedding are strong, and strong emotions make for a rich feast. To identify the bone bridegroom, it casts no shadow. It leaves no footprints in soft earth. Its touch is cold as winter stone. It smells of the grave, and its breath carries the stench of decay. It cannot cross running water or enter a home uninvited. It cannot touch iron or silver, and it fears the sound of church bells. To destroy the bone bridegroom, the bones from which it is made must be found and properly blessed by a man of God. They must then be buried in consecrated ground with all the proper rites for the dead. Only then will the spirit find peace, and only then will its hunger be satisfied. But beware, the bone bridegroom grows stronger with each passing day. The longer it walks among the living, the more real it becomes. If it is allowed to complete its purpose, to claim its bride in unholy matrimony, it will become fully corporeal, and no force on earth will be able to destroy it. Vivian closed the journal with shaking hands. The sun was setting outside her windows, painting the walls with long shadows that seemed to move and writhe in the failing light. She thought about David's body, broken and buried in a cemetery 60 miles away. She thought about the thing that had worn his face, had stood in her living room and asked her to marry it among the tombstones. And she thought about what would happen if she refused. The phone rang, sharp and sudden in the gathering darkness. Vivian almost didn't answer it, afraid of what she might hear on the other end of the line. But on the fourth ring, she picked up the receiver. Hello? Hello, darling? David's voice, warm and familiar and completely wrong. I hope you're getting ready for tomorrow night. David, we need to talk. What's there to talk about? We're getting married just like we planned. Although I have to say, I'm a bit hurt that you haven't told anyone about the change of venue. I saw Janet Morrison at the post office this afternoon, and she seemed to think we were still planning a morning ceremony at the church. You spoke to Janet? Lovely woman. She invited me to dinner Sunday night. I told her we'd probably be too busy with our honeymoon to accept social invitations. There was something horrible about the way he said honeymoon. Something that made Vivian's skin crawl. David, please, I know what you are. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, very quietly, do you now? Mrs. Pembridge told me about the accident. About the real David. Ah, dear old Aunt Dorothy, I should have known she'd interfere. His voice was changing now, becoming something else. Something colder. That woman always was too clever for her own good. You're not David. I'm more David than anyone has ever been. I know everything he knew, feel everything he felt. I love you exactly as much as he did. More, perhaps. David's love was human, limited, mortal. Mine is eternal. You're dead. So is David. But I'm offering you something he never could. A love that will last forever. Literally forever. We'll never grow old, never grow apart, never disappoint each other. Isn't that what every bride dreams of? Vivian gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. What happens if I don't come tomorrow night? Oh, you'll come. You won't be able to help yourself. The closer we get to midnight, the stronger the pull will become. You'll find yourself walking to the cemetery whether you want to or not. The only choice you have is whether to come willingly or fighting every step of the way. And if I do come, then we'll be married as we planned. You'll be my wife and I'll be your husband, and we'll be together always. You'll never have to worry about losing me again. Because I'll be dead. Because you'll be mine. The line went dead. Vivian stood holding the silent receiver, listening to the sound of her own rapid breathing. Outside, the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting pale circles of light on the empty sidewalks. Tomorrow was Saturday. Tomorrow was her wedding day. She had less than 24 hours to figure out how to save herself. Saturday morning dawned gray and cold, unseasonably cool for June. Vivian had spent the night reading and rereading her great-grandmother's journal, looking for anything that might help her. The instructions were clear enough. Find David's bones, have them blessed, bury them properly. But David's bones were in Burlington, 60 miles away, in a cemetery she'd never seen. She tried calling the police, but how could she explain? She tried calling Reverend Morrison, but the man who answered the phone didn't sound like the Reverend at all. His voice was too deep, too cold. And when she asked if she could speak to Janet, he told her that Janet was indisposed. Perhaps I can help you instead, the voice said. I understand you're getting married tonight. How exciting. Vivian hung up without another word. By noon, she had made her decision. She would go to Burlington. She would find David's grave, and she would do whatever was necessary to put his spirit to rest. It was the only way to break the hold the creature had over her. She packed quickly. The journal, a thermos of coffee, her mother's silver cross, and a small bottle of holy water she'd taken from the church years ago when she'd been too embarrassed to ask for it directly. She also took the iron poker from beside the fireplace, wrapping it in an old blanket and laying it across the back seat of her car. The drive to Burlington should have taken an hour and a half. It took her nearly 3 hours, partly because she got lost twice and partly because she kept having to pull over to fight the growing compulsion to turn around. The closer she got to Burlington, the stronger the pull became. Not toward the cemetery where David was buried, but back toward Millbrook. Back toward the cemetery where something was waiting for her. By the time she found Pine Grove Cemetery, the sun was setting. The cemetery was larger than she'd expected, with rows upon rows of headstones stretching away into the gathering darkness. She parked near the entrance and walked among the graves, reading names and dates by the light of her flashlight. She found David's grave in the newest section. marked by a simple granite headstone. David James Crane, 1923 to 1948, beloved son and fiancé. The earth around the grave was still raw, not yet covered by grass. Fresh flowers lay wilted on the mound. Roses, white roses, just like the ones Mrs. Hartley had seen the night David first appeared. Vivian knelt beside the grave and placed her hand on the cold earth. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." Then she began to dig. It was horrible work. The earth was soft but heavy, and she had only her hands and a small gardening trowel she'd found in the trunk of her car. By the time she reached the coffin, her fingernails were broken and bleeding, her dress torn and filthy. But she could feel something different, a lightness, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. The coffin was simple pine, already beginning to warp from the moisture in the soil. The lid was loose, held in place by only a few nails. Vivian pried it open with the poker, then shone her flashlight inside. David lay exactly as she remembered him, peaceful in death. His eyes were closed, his hands folded across his chest. He looked younger somehow, freed from the worries and tensions that had marked his living face. There was no supernatural animation, no desperate pleading, just the simple, final rest that death should bring. And yet, as she looked at him, she felt a profound sense of clarity wash over her. This was David. This quiet, still figure was the man she had loved, not the thing that had stood in her living room, speaking of midnight weddings and eternal devotion. The real David would never have asked her to sacrifice her safety, her sanity, her very life for the sake of his desires. The real David had respected her too much for that. Working quickly, she sprinkled holy water over his body and spoke the prayer her great-grandmother had written in the journal. The words felt strange in her mouth, older than English, older than Christianity itself. As she spoke them, she felt something shift in the air around her. Not supernatural, but psychological. A letting go, a final goodbye. Then the temperature around her dropped 20 degrees, and she heard footsteps approaching across the cemetery. "You shouldn't have come here, Vivian." She turned to see the creature that wore David's face, walking toward her between the headstones. But it wasn't bothering to maintain the illusion anymore. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in claws, its teeth sharp and yellow in the moonlight. Its eyes were deep pits of shadow, and when it spoke, its voice was the sound of dirt falling on coffin lids. "You're going to ruin everything," it said. "We could have been so happy together." "You're not David." Vivian stood up, the iron poker in her hands. David would never have wanted this. David is dead. I'm all that's left of him now. I'm his love for you, made manifest. Isn't that beautiful? You're his bones animated by hunger and malice. You're nothing but death wearing a familiar face. The creature laughed to sound like breaking glass. "And yet you loved me. For 3 days, you loved me completely. You were going to marry me, give yourself to me willingly. What does that say about your precious David?" "It says that love makes us blind sometimes. But I can see you now. Can you? Look again." Suddenly it was David standing before her. The real David, exactly as she remembered him. Warm brown eyes, gentle smile, a small scar on his chin from a childhood accident. He looked exactly as he had the day he proposed, kneeling in her mother's garden among the roses. "Vivian, please," he said, and his voice was perfect, beloved, absolutely right. "I love you. I've come back for you. Isn't that what you wanted? Isn't that what you prayed for when you heard about the accident?" She had prayed for it. She had begged God to bring him back, to give them one more chance, to let their love story have a happy ending. And looking at him now, she could almost believe it had worked. "You're not him," she said, but her voice was weaker now. "I'm exactly him. I know everything he knew, feel everything he felt. I know how you like your coffee in the morning, how you hum when you're nervous, how you taste when I kiss you. I know that you're afraid of spiders and that you cry during sad movies and that you've been planning our children's names since our second date. I know you better than anyone alive because I am the part of David that loved you most. If you're really David, then you'll let me finish what I started. You'll let me put your body to rest properly. My body is at rest. I'm here with you, where I belong. Your body is trapped, and so is your soul. That's why you can't find peace. I don't want peace. I want you." The creature stepped closer, and despite everything she knew, Vivian felt herself wavering. This was David's face, David's voice, David's eyes looking at her with perfect love. How could she be certain it wasn't really him? How could she be sure this wasn't some miracle, some gift from a God who had finally decided to answer her prayers? "Come with me," the creature whispered, reaching out to touch her face. "Let me make you my wife. Let me love you forever." Its fingers were inches from her cheek when she heard another voice, faint but clear. "Don't listen to it, Vivian. That's not me." She looked down at the coffin, where David's body lay peaceful and still. His eyes were closed now, but his lips were moving, forming words that seemed to come from very far away. "I'm dead, darling. I've been dead since Friday night. That thing, it's using my love for you to keep itself alive. Don't let it. Please don't let it." The creature snarled, its beautiful mask slipping for just a moment. "Ignore him. He's confused, disoriented. Death does that to people. I'm the one who's real now. I'm the one who can touch you, hold you, love you." But Vivian was no longer listening. She knelt beside the coffin again, her mind racing. The creature had said something earlier, and about David's love for her, about knowing everything he knew. And there had been something else, something that had been nagging at her since their first conversation. "I know how you like your coffee in the morning, how you hum when you're nervous, how you taste when I kiss you. I know that you're afraid of spiders and that you cry during sad movies and that you've been planning our children's names since our second date." But David had never kissed her. Not really. A chaste peck on the cheek after church, perhaps, or a brief touch of lips when he'd proposed. They had been courting properly, respectably, saving true intimacy for marriage. The creature's knowledge was imperfect, built from observation and assumption rather than genuine experience. And then she remembered. Their place. The garden where he'd proposed. The spot where they had been happiest. Where their love had felt most real and pure. If the creature was truly made from David's bones, from his love for her, then it would have been drawn to that place like iron filings to a magnet. "I have to go," she said, standing. "I have to finish this." She kissed David's forehead, cold and still, but somehow peaceful, and whispered goodbye. Then she turned to face the creature that had been waiting patiently behind her. "Going somewhere?" it asked. "Home." "I don't think so." It lunged at her with claws extended, but Vivian was ready. She swung the iron poker like a baseball bat, connecting with the creature's skull with a sound like breaking china. The thing stumbled backward, its beautiful face cracking like a porcelain mask. "Ion," it hissed. "Clever girl. I had a good teacher." She ran then, racing through the cemetery toward her car with the creature's enraged howls echoing behind her. She could hear it following, its footsteps unnaturally quick on the soft earth. But she had a head start, and more importantly, she had a purpose. The drive back to Millbrook was a nightmare of winding roads and growing darkness. Every few minutes, Vivian caught glimpses of something in her rearview mirror. The pale figure running between the trees, keeping pace with her car despite the fact that she was driving 50 miles an hour. Sometimes it looked like David. Sometimes it looked like something that had never been human at all. By the time she reached the outskirts of town, it was nearly 11 o'clock. The streets were empty, porch lights glowing in windows like watchful eyes. She drove straight to her house, parked in the driveway, and ran to the back garden. The oak tree stood exactly as it always had, its broad branches spreading protectively over the space where her mother had once grown prize-winning roses. But now Vivian saw it differently, not just as the romantic setting where David had proposed, but as the sacred center of their love story. The place where he had knelt in the soft earth and offered her his grandmother's ring. The place where she had said yes with tears of joy streaming down her face. If the creature was truly made from David's memory, from the echo of his love for her, then it would have buried its heart here. The most precious pieces of itself hidden in the soil that had witnessed their happiest moment. She knelt at the base of the tree and began to dig with her bare hands, no longer following instinct but logic. The earth here was softer than elsewhere in the garden, disturbed more recently than the surrounding flower beds. And there, 18 inches down, just where David might have knelt, her fingers struck something hard and smooth. She found them buried in a careful arrangement, bones white as moonlight, laid out in the rough shape of a human figure. A skull, ribs, finger bones, leg bones, but wrong somehow, too many of some and not enough of others, as if they'd been assembled by someone who had only a passing familiarity with human anatomy. And at the center of the arrangement, nestled among the ribs like a heart, was her engagement ring. The ring David had given her 6 months ago, the one she'd thought she'd lost the week before the wedding. She'd picked it up with trembling fingers, and the diamond was so cold it burned her skin. You found them. Vivian looked up to see the creature standing at the edge of the garden. It no longer bothered to look like David. Instead, it appeared as what it truly was, a collection of bones held together by malice and hunger, wrapped in a thin veneer of stolen flesh. Its eye sockets were empty pits, its jaw unhinged like a snake's. "Clever girl," it said again, its voice the sound of wind through a graveyard. "But you're too late. Do you know what time it is?" Vivian glanced at her watch. 11:58. 2 minutes until midnight. 2 minutes until our wedding. I can feel you being drawn to me, can't I? The compulsion is getting stronger. She could feel it, a terrible pull in her chest, as if an invisible rope were wrapped around her ribs and someone was slowly tightening it. Her feet began to move of their own accord, carrying her toward the creature. "That's right," it crooned. "Come to me, beloved. Let me make you my bride." But Vivian had one more card to play. With her free hand, she pulled out the bottle of holy water and poured it over the bones at her feet. The creature screamed, a sound like metal tearing, and stumbled backward. "The power of Christ compels you," she said, not because she was particularly religious, but because it seemed like the sort of thing one said in situations like this. "Christ has no power here," the creature snarled. "This is older than Christ, older than your little God. This is love and death and the hunger that lies between them." It was right, Vivian realized. The holy water had hurt it, but not enough. She needed something else, something stronger. But as she began to speak the prayer from her great-grandmother's journal, she understood what she really had to do. The creature made one last desperate lunge toward her, but she was ready. Instead of retreating, she stepped forward and pressed her engagement ring into the center of the bone arrangement. The diamond, symbol of their promised future, their shared dreams, their mortal love, burned like a star against the ancient bones. "I choose to let him go," she said, and meant it. "I choose to remember our love as it was, finite, human, real, rather than let you twist it into something monstrous. David is at peace. Our love was beautiful because it ended. Because he was brave enough to die rather than become what you are. The creature let out a sound that was part shriek, part sob. You don't understand, it wailed. I could have loved you forever, literally forever. I could have given you everything he couldn't. Love doesn't possess, Vivian said firmly. Love doesn't consume. Love doesn't demand that someone sacrifice themselves to feed another's hunger. You were never love. You were just loneliness wearing love's face. As she spoke the final words of the prayer, the church bells began to toll midnight in the distance. The creature collapsed into itself like a building falling down, bones crumbling to dust, engagement ring rolling away across the grass, no longer burning cold, but merely metal and stone warmed by her living hand. And in the sudden silence that followed, she felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death: peace. She knelt in her mother's garden for a long time, surrounded by the ruins of a love that had been too strong for death, but too fragile for the thing that had tried to claim it. When she finally stood up, her knees were shaking and her dress was ruined, but she was alive. She was free, and she was alone. 3 months later, Vivian stood in the kitchen of her small house, packing the last of her mother's china into newspaper-lined boxes. The house had sold quickly. Apparently, the story of what had happened that night hadn't spread as widely as she'd feared, or perhaps the people of Millbrook were simply more practical than superstitious when it came to real estate prices. She was moving to Boston, where she had a job waiting at a publishing house in a small apartment near the Common. The position wasn't glamorous, assistant to an editor who specialized in women's fiction. But it was hers, earned through her own efforts and qualifications rather than through family connections or a husband's influence. She'd considered staying in Millbrook. The house was paid for. Her mother's friends had rallied around her with casseroles and sympathy, and there was a certain comfort in the familiar rhythms of small-town life. But every time she walked past the cemetery or saw the oak tree in what used to be her garden, she was reminded not of horror, but of something more complex. The realization that she had saved herself. Mrs. Pembridge had helped her understand what had really happened, providing context that made the supernatural elements feel less like madness and more like a particularly vivid manifestation of grief and guilt. The creature had fed on her sorrow, her refusal to let David go, her desperate wish that love could somehow conquer death. It wasn't personal, the old woman had explained over tea and ginger biscuits. It would have done the same thing to any woman whose beloved died at the wrong time. You were just unlucky in your timing. Then why did it feel so personal? Vivian had asked. Because it used his memories, his feelings. In a way, it really did love you. Or at least, it loved you with the echo of his love. That's what made it so dangerous. And that's what made it so hard to resist. Now, wrapping her mother's teacups in tissue paper, Vivian thought about love and its counterfeits, about the difference between devotion and obsession, between wanting someone and wanting to possess them completely. The creature had offered her eternal love, but what it had really offered was eternal imprisonment, a love without growth, without change, without the possibility of choice. Real love, she'd learned, sometimes meant letting go. She sealed the last box and carried it to the front hallway where it joined the modest collection of belongings that represented her entire life. It wasn't much. A few pieces of furniture, some books, her clothes, her grandmother's jewelry. But it was hers, All of it was hers, chosen by her, owned by her, representing a future that belonged entirely to her. Outside, the moving truck would arrive tomorrow morning to take her belongings to Boston. Tonight, she would sleep in this house one last time, surrounded by the ghosts of her childhood and the echo of a love that had been real, if brief. As she walked through the empty rooms, turning off lights and checking windows, Vivian felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death: anticipation. Not for romance or rescue or the arrival of some new man to give her life meaning, but for the simple pleasure of discovering who she might become when she was accountable to no one but herself. The sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, she thought. Almost beautiful enough to make her want to stay. Almost. But not quite. She had places to go, a life to live, a future to build. And somewhere, in whatever place the truly dead went to rest, David Crane was finally at peace, knowing that the woman he'd loved was safe and free and whole. That, Vivian thought, as she locked the front door behind her, was the kind of love story worth telling. The kind where love meant letting go. The kind where the woman saved herself.